The rain in Seattle doesn't wash things clean, it only presses the grime deeper into the pavement. I was staring at the crime scene photos spread across my desk, the third one this month, when I realized the pattern wasn't in how they died. It was in how they were left. They were posed like broken dolls, arranged in a chilling tableau that whispered of a twisted sense of artistry. The press called him the architect. I just called him a ghost. My name is Detective Elias Thorne, and I have spent 20 years chasing monsters in the dark corners of the American dream. But this one felt different. He wasn't just killing, he was constructing a legacy. It started with a frantic call from a roadside motel on the outskirts of Tacoma. A maid had walked into room 204 expecting to find a checked-out guest. Instead, she found a masterpiece of horror. The victim, a young woman, was seated at a vanity, a mirror positioned perfectly to catch the first light of dawn. When I arrived, the air was thick with the scent of cheap cologne and blood. My partner, Detective Sarah Jenkins, was already there, her face a mask of professional detachment that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Look at the hands, Elias," she said, pointing to the victim's wrists. They were tied with intricate, nautical knots. Whoever did this took their time. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was an installation. I leaned in, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. There were no prints, no DNA, not even a stray hair. Just a single, weathered chess piece left on the nightstand. A black knight. "He's playing a game," I murmured, the weight of the realization settling into my bones like lead. "And we are just the pieces he's moving across the board." I didn't know then that this was only the beginning. As I walked out into the relentless drizzle, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. The architect wasn't just watching us, he was inviting us into his studio, and he was already planning our next move. The investigation would lead us through the forgotten heart of the Pacific Northwest, into the lives of people who had been discarded by society, and deeper into my own past than I ever wanted to go. Because as I stared at that black knight, I realized that I had seen it before. A long time ago, in a case that had nearly broken me. The hunt had begun, and the shadows were already starting to close in. The rain didn't stop, but the city's indifference was even more biting. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was suffocating. The brass wanted results, and they wanted them yesterday. They didn't care about nautical knots or chess pieces, they cared about optics, public panic, and keeping the mayor's approval ratings afloat. I spent hours staring at the map of Seattle pinned to my office wall. I had marked the locations of the 3 victims with red pushpins. When I stepped back, the pattern hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a random sprawl. The locations formed a perfect, brutal isosceles triangle, with the heart of the city at its center. "He's mapping his own kingdom," Sarah said, stepping into my office with 2 cups of bitter, lukewarm coffee. She followed my gaze to the map, her expression tightening. "Elias, if this is a sequence, he's not done. He's building towards something." I took the coffee, my hands still faintly shaking from the adrenaline of the crime scene. "He's an artist, Sarah. Every murder is a brushstroke. And if he's following a geometric progression, the next one isn't just a place, it's a time." I dove back into the files, ignoring the hum of the precinct. I pulled up the cold case from 15 years ago, the one that had left me with a permanent limp and a haunted mind. The killer then had used a similar signature. The careful, obsessive positioning of the bodies. But he had been caught, or so we thought. He had died in prison 4 years ago. Could there be a copycat? Or had we put the wrong man away? As I cross-referenced the knot-tying technique with the old case files, I found a discrepancy. The knots in the old cases were tight, functional, and desperate. The knots in this case were ornate, almost ceremonial. "It's not a copycat," I whispered to the empty room. "It's an evolution." Suddenly, the phone on my desk rang, a jarring sound that pierced the silence. I picked it up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Detective Thorne, a voice rasped on the other end, a voice that sounded like grinding glass. You're looking in the past to find a future that hasn't been written yet. But you're forgetting one thing. Every architect needs a cornerstone. The line went dead. My blood ran cold. The caller knew who I was, and he knew exactly what I was searching for. He wasn't just playing a game anymore, he was taunting me, inviting me into a labyrinth of his own design. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with alarm. Elias? What was that? He's in the room, Sarah, I said, looking around the bustling office. Not here, but he's here. He's watching. And he's waiting for us to make the next mistake. We were no longer just detectives, we were prey in a game of grand, geometric malice, and the architect was just getting started. The phone call had been a scalpel, peeling back the layers of my carefully constructed composure. I couldn't shake the sound of that rasping voice. It wasn't just a stranger's taunt, it was a ghost from a nightmare I thought I had buried. I spent the next 48 hours with Sarah, scouring the city's archives for any connection between the old cases and the current horrors. We found it in a dusty municipal basement, buried under boxes of uncatalogued property records. It was a blueprint, not of a building, but of a house. The address led us to an abandoned Victorian on the edge of the industrial district. The windows were boarded up like eyes sewn shut, and the porch sagged under the weight of decades of rot. This is it, I whispered, my hand hovering over the heavy iron door handle. He's been drawing us here from the beginning. We entered with our weapons drawn, the silence inside thicker than the air outside. The house smelled of damp earth and something sweet, like decaying lilies. We moved through the foyer, our flashlights cutting through the heavy darkness, illuminating swirls of dust motes that danced like specters. On the third floor, we found the attic. It was a cathedral of obsession. The walls were covered in intricate sketches, hundreds of them, all depicting the victims we had found, and some we hadn't. In the center of the room, arranged on a low, velvet-covered table, were chess sets. Not just one, but a dozen, all set up in the opening moves of legendary matches. Elias, Sarah's voice trembled. She pointed to a corner of the attic. There, sitting in a rocking chair, was a mannequin. It was dressed in my old coat, the one I had worn during the trial 15 years ago. It held a framed photograph of me in its stiff, plastic hands. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The architect wasn't just mocking the law, he was deconstructing my life. He had been following me for years, gathering the pieces, studying the man who had failed to stop him the first time. He was never in prison, I realized, the horror finally settling into clarity. The man we convicted. He was just the architect's protégé. The real architect has been watching us from the shadows, grooming us to be the final witnesses to his masterpiece. Just then, a floorboard creaked behind us. We spun around, but the attic was empty, save for the rhythmic clack-clack of a chess piece being moved on the table. Someone had just completed a move. We weren't just investigating a crime, we were trapped inside a meticulously crafted theater of madness, and the final act was already playing out before our eyes. The clack-clack of the chess piece echoed through the attic like a gunshot in a library. Sarah and I moved in unison, our flashlights sweeping the corners, but the space was deceptively large, filled with stacks of forgotten furniture and decaying remnants of lives long past. The room felt alive, breathing with the architect's presence, yet he remained a phantom, a whisper just out of reach. I approached the velvet table. The piece that had been moved was a white pawn, my pawn. It had been shifted into a suicidal position, directly into the path of the Black Queen. He's not running, Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a breath. He's forcing our hand. He wants us to see the endgame. Sarah knelt by the table, her light fixed on a note tucked beneath the chessboard. She used a pen to flip it over. It wasn't written in ink, it was pressed into the paper, a cold, clinical indentation. To catch the player, you must become the game. He's leading us to the docks, Sarah whispered, her face pale. This map. The sketches. Look, Elias. These coordinates lead to the derelict terminal on Pier 42. My blood ran cold. Pier 42 was where the very first case of my career had ended, the one where I had failed to save the victim, the one that had cost me my reputation and nearly my life. It was a place of ghosts, and the architect knew it. He was pulling me back to the scene of my original sin, intending to force a collision between my past and my present. We didn't wait for backup. The architect had made it clear. This was a private affair. If we called for help, he would disappear, and the cycle would continue. We drove through the slick, rain-drenched streets of Seattle in silence, the weight of the coming confrontation pressing against our chests like an iron plate. As we arrived at the terminal, the structure loomed over us like the skeleton of a beach leviathan. The fog rolling off the Puget Sound swallowed the light, leaving only the dim, flickering orange glow of a distant street lamp. Stay close, I warned, my hand gripping my sidearm. We stepped into the terminal, the vast, echoing space filled with the rhythmic dripping of water and the groaning of rusted metal. Somewhere in the deep shadows of the rafters, I heard a soft, rhythmic humming. It was a lullaby, the same one my mother used to sing to me before the world fell apart. He wasn't just killing victims anymore. He was coming for me, and he was using the music of my own childhood to signal the final move. The terminal was a graveyard of industrial ambition, filled with the skeletons of cranes and the scent of salt and rot. The humming grew louder, a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I motioned for Sarah to take the western flank, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Elias, she whispered over the comms, her voice trembling. Look at the floor. I aimed my light downward. A series of chalk-white lines had been drawn across the concrete, a massive, sprawling chessboard that spanned the entire terminal floor. We were standing in the middle of it. And there, standing on the opposite side of the board, was a figure cloaked in the gloom. It was him. The architect. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a tall, gaunt silhouette holding a long, rusted steel rod, the same one that had been used as a weapon in my first failed case. It ends here, I shouted, my voice echoing through the vast space. The game is over. He stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw his face in the flickering orange light. He looked like me. Not a twin, but a reflection of what I might have become if the darkness had finally won. He wasn't a stranger, he was the embodiment of every case I hadn't solved, every life I hadn't saved, and every doubt that had plagued my conscience for 2 decades. He charged, not with the frenzied rage of a killer, but with the calculated precision of a grandmaster. We collided in a brutal, desperate dance of steel and bone. I felt the impact of his weapon against my ribs, the air escaping my lungs in a sharp gasp. I struck back, my fist finding his jaw, the taste of blood coppersweet in my mouth. It was a fight not just for my life, but for my soul. As I wrestled him to the ground, pinning him beneath the crushing weight of my own failures, I looked into his eyes, and saw nothing. No malice, no triumph, only a void that mirrored the depth of my own exhaustion. Why? I gasped, the rain now pouring through the holes in the roof, drenching us both. He didn't answer. He simply smiled, a thin, fragile line that vanished as the sirens began to wail in the distance. Sarah had finally called for backup. He slumped against the rusted floor, his life force fading into the damp concrete. The architect was gone. The game had reached its conclusion. As the police lights flooded the terminal, casting long, dancing shadows across the chalkboard, I stood up, my body bruised and broken, but my mind finally clear. The shadows would always be there, waiting, watching. But for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't afraid of them. I had stared into the heart of the abyss, and I had returned to tell the tale. The architect had played his final move, but it was I who had the last word.